Lightning does crash, but as we talked a little bit about yesterday, actually a lot of bit about, so do stock markets. So we're just going to pick up right where we left off yesterday. Sorry, guys, I got the sniffles and I've been coughing, but we'll get through this. All right, so just super quick to recap what we talked about yesterday: economic practices. Remember, spending and income have skyrocketed. Sort of laissez-faire regulation on the markets, just generally um, being reckless, being the powers that be being reckless. I think this is where we left off. The nation's sick economy. The year is 1929. The U.S. economy has collapsed. Farms, businesses, and banks nationwide are failing, causing massive unemployment and poverty. You are out of work with little prospect of finding a job. Remember, we said right now in 2020 the unemployment rate is approaching 10. It's like somewhere between like 6 and 9 last I saw. And that's considered just this catastrophe, and it is a very, very serious issue. But remember, back at this point, it was 3 times that, 4 times that, in fact. All right, here's a claim, and we're going to see if this is right. During the Great Depression, Americans did what they had to do to survive. Let's continue looking at notable characters from the era. This is a woman named Dorothea Lange. And Dorothea is going to be known above all else for her photojournalism, her contributions to the world of journalism, specifically as a photographer. This is Cameras had been around for decades at this point, but they're becoming better and easier to travel with, and all these things to where this is one of the first times in history. And actually, I really shouldn't say that, because there are some really good photographs from the Civil War, but the photography is still very crude. It's not as polished. And Lang, her big achievement was that she was able to put a human face on the Depression. She was able to show the actual effect it had on human beings, on American citizens. So her being able to distribute those images on a massive scale, that raised awareness for the problem and inspired action. So she's a photographer, but she's also known as an activist of sorts. Impact of the Great Depression on African Americans. This right here is such a perfect phrase. As the last hired and the first fired, African Americans entered the Depression long before the stock market crash in 1929, and they stayed there longer than other Americans. By 1933, African Americans found it all but impossible to find jobs of any kind in agriculture or industry. So, given race relations and the fact that the vast majority of businesses were owned by white people, just given the nature of the way things were set up back then, Not only were black people the first to be let go, but they found it very hard to find employment once unemployed. Which I suppose that's pretty self-explanatory. Emma Tiller describes sharecropping during the Depression. In 1929, me and my husband were sharecroppers. We made a crop that year. The owners taken all the crop. This horrible way of living with almost nothing lasted up until Roosevelt. There was another strangest thing. I didn't suffer for food through the 30s because there was plenty of food that really suffered, plenty of people that really suffered much worse. When you go through a lot, you're in better condition to survive through all these kinds of things. My great grandparents were sharecroppers. My great great grandparents were sharecroppers, and uh, my grandmother was what she referred to herself as a child of the Depression. And in her description, it was not until FDR put in the New Deal and her dad was able to get a job on the WPA that they were able to essentially eat with any regularity. I mean, it was a lot of people felt the effects of the Depression, and I can assure you that my grandmother and her family did not own stocks; they were poor, but you didn't have to have a direct stake in the stock market. You didn't have to own shares of a company to be affected by this. That really is pretty interesting. An ironic juxtaposition. African American flood victims line up for relief below a billboard with beaming white family proclaiming world's highest standard of living. Wow. Do you guys remember what this is talking about? Where he says, "But why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good?" And he says, "I did." Remember, victim of bank failure? Some of these smaller banks literally just ran out of money. They went broke. So, guys like this fellow in the cartoon, he was wise enough to set aside savings, but it didn't matter in the end. So everybody in America, not everybody, but a huge chunk of Americans were out of work. Massive layoffs, unemployment, falling wages, factory worker wages fell by one third. So even if you were lucky enough to keep your job, you're still making significantly less money. Immigration decreased, right? If you were looking for if when America was thriving and you were looking for a land of opportunity, well, that's a really attractive proposition. But if things in America are as bleak or nearly as bleak as the conditions in your home country, why would you immigrate? Um, and right there, as we said, by 1933, as much as 25 to 50% of African Americans were unemployed. The percentage of women in the workforce increased in the 1930s. Why do you think that would be? Well, because suddenly they needed every penny they could get, and if the husband lost his job at the factory, the wife may accept some other job. The Dust Bowl. We've been dealing with some intense weather as of late, but this was pretty epic. In December 1935, experts estimated that 850 million tons of topsoil had blown off the southern plains during the course of the year, affecting 4.3 acres of land. Excuse me, 4.3 million acres of land. If the drought were to continue, they speculated that figure would rise to 5.3 million acres in just a few months. So if you guys followed that, literally 4.3 million acres were covered with sand. This one, that appears to be an automobile or a cart of some kind. I mean, unbelievable. Percent of U.S. in moderate to extreme drought. Um, this was the primary drought. This is the 1930s Dust Bowl. You can see it's without a doubt the highest. In the 1950s, they saw another upsurge, but we're going to call that the mini Dust Bowl. And it's hovered more or less in the same. It's fluctuated, but uh, it seems like it's about average right now. Huh. Let's see if we can find this. Because I don't think it's going to let me um, click that link. In fact, I know it's not. All right. Wouldn't let me click on that. That's all right. Bread lines, just what they sound like. I mean, look at all these people. A shanty is basically just a shack, a rundown shack. So there were these little villages basically that popped up of these shanties, people who lost their homes. And as a criticism, as a knock on Hoover, President Herbert Hoover, they called him Hoovervilles, basically associating his name with him to suggest that it was his fault or that he wasn't doing enough. From 29 to 32, about 400,000 farmers lose their land. So when I say that people thought that Hoover may not have done enough or didn't do enough, right there, he felt like it would correct itself. Sorry, guys. He felt like it would correct itself and that the states really should be more hands on. We did see great impact from various charitable organizations. So I'm paraphrasing, but with all this stuff going on right now, I heard a quote from Mr. Rogers where he was talking about his mom, and he said that his mom told him in times of crisis, always look for the helpers. So there were helpers. One out of every five children in New York suffered from malnutrition. And again, these shanty towns, collections of makeshift shelters built out of packing boxes, scrap lumber, corrugated iron, and other thrown away items rose up outside of America's cities. I mentioned this yesterday, the increase in suicide attempts. More than 20,000 Americans committed suicide in 1932, a 28% increase. That's pretty shocking right there. My goodness. Um, why? The shame of being unemployed, losing businesses and homes, being unable to provide for family members, children. Guys, don't ever do that. So, how did it affect the workforce? Well, it caused a ton of them to get fired. It completely destroyed the workforce. What impact did the Great Depression have on living conditions in rural areas? Well, in at least 4.3 million acres worth, they were basically run off. There was a gigantic dust storm. In other areas, they struggled to uh, get food to eat a lot of the times. How were urban communities affected by the Great Depression? In what ways did individuals and communities try to cope? Well, urban communities were terrible as well. We talked about tenement housing and the slums. So people in the country weren't doing well, but neither were people in the city. How did it alter family life? Well, for one, females entering the workforce, so having a working mother. And again, this was still the exception to the rule. It was much more common that a woman was a homemaker, but um, still, we do see that uptick. So that's one way. Hoover says, I do not believe that the power and duty of the federal government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering. The lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people. Guys, what the heck is he talking about? That's a president who clearly has no concern for the well being of his people. Yeah, for a president to come right out and say it's not the federal government's job to relieve people to help their suffering. That's why people who were suffering in those shanty towns called them Hoovervilles. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? I do not believe that the power and duty of the federal government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering. The lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government, and the government should not support the people. I don't know, guys. Maybe you agree. I personally disagree. So, radio shows were really big back then. This is the first ever Disney cartoon. I think it was called Tugboat Willie or something. Um, Babe Ruth, I believe that's Lou Gehrig, somewhere over the rainbow. Many people have left their jobs for a more profitable one of selling apples. This guy looks like, he's dressed like a businessman. I doubt that he was trained as an apple salesman. Blame it on Hoover. What is it and why should America blame it on Hoover? Well, it in this case is the Depression. Why should they blame it on Hoover? He didn't take action. Who might the people that are pointing at Hoover be, and why did the cartoonists pick them? They are people who lost money in the stock market, I suppose. All businessmen. What point is the cartoonist trying to make? I would say that people from all over the world are pointing at Hoover as being to blame. So Hoover leaves office and Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes his place. But before that, he, in fairness to him, came in an extremely tight spot. He had been in office less than a year. when it all crashed. I would say this quote did not age well. Shortly before the Depression, Hoover is quoted as saying, "We are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before," basically saying that we could defeat poverty and make it a thing of the past. Prior to the crash, most people believed in this laissez-faire policy, but after the crash, even people who previously were opposed to a lot of federal regulations in the stock market opened up to the idea that those regulations may be necessary. Hoover also used to talk about the importance of volunteerism. Basically, businesses should just take it upon themselves to do the right thing, to pay higher wages, to help out with other people's struggles. Basically, and long story short, he believed in more or less no help. I mean, essentially no help. One criticism that Hoover had was the idea. One hesitance that he had was the idea of raising the federal budget. Um, he felt like direct federal relief would take away the self respect from the hardworking people who needed the relief. This is the same argument that you often see against modern social welfare programs, that it prevents people from learning to cope with things on their own. That was Hoover's thought. So all these people, remember, 1 in 5 children in New York at this point was getting underfed. There was a demand for food, but they couldn't pay for it. So if you can't pay for it, then you're not going to be buying it, which would mean that the providers of that food were going to lose money, right? Because if you can't afford to buy their product, well, then they've got to lower their prices. So you can't afford it, or else they're not going to sell any. So everybody struggled. Every link in the food chain. Cotton prices plummet. Finally, we do get some effort, small effort to boost the economy. It's going to spend $800 million on various public works programs, basically government programs that would provide employment for people. And one of them, really his biggest one and his primary accomplishment as president, was the building of the Hoover Dam. So even though Hoover was and is generally remembered as a colossal failure, he did get the Hoover Dam built. So this is about 3 minutes. It's 3 minutes and 20 seconds long. We're gonna watch it as we're coming up on that 30-minute time frame. So you guys do have an assignment that goes along with this. And hope you're having an awesome week. All right, guys. With that, we are going to wrap it up and we'll pick up here tomorrow. So, you guys do have an assignment that goes along with um, this lesson. So, make sure that you get that in. It's due Friday. Talk to you tomorrow.